We're now going to move on to our opening panel, which will reflect back on the Lancet-University of Oslo Commission on Global Governance for Health, 10 years after it was published. So, panelists, you can please take your seat. So it was 10 years ago that this commission released its report, which focused in on the political origins of health inequity. And the report was mainly concerned with the global political determinants of health, which it defined as the transnational norms, policies, and practices that arise from political interaction across all sectors that affect health. So rather than focus on the global health governance system, as some of us often do, it analyzed power disparities and dynamics across a range of 7 transnational areas that affect health and that can only be tackled through global cooperation. And these included austerity, intellectual property regimes, the conduct of transnational corporations, migration, and armed violence. And it focused on how improved global governance would be required to tackle this. The Commission further identified 5 dysfunctions of the global governance system that allow the adverse effects of the global political determinants of health to persist, and argued that power asymmetry and global social norms limit the range of choice and constrain action on health equity. And the Commission was, I think, arguably very influential in raising attention to these global governance processes and the global political determinants of health. But it was also critiqued for some of its recommendations, which critics claim didn't go far enough in pushing for transformative change. So the aim of this opening session is to reflect on the legacy of this commission in light of what has happened since the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical shifts, escalating violent conflict, and all the other challenges relating to climate and environment that shape current global health inequities. So I am going to move over here now to introduce the 6 fantastic panelists who were each associated with the Commission in one way or another, and who are therefore uniquely placed to comment on its contributions, identify its blind spots, and its legacies, both for research, practice, and politics. So let me first introduce Ole Petter Ottersen, here on my right, who chaired the Commission. Professor Ottersen is the former rector of our university, and as well as the former president of Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and has recently returned to the University of Oslo's Faculty of Medicine, and is in the process of launching also a new commission that will revisit some of the themes we're discussing today. Next, Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, who you just heard from, is my co-chair on the collective and also served as a commissioner 10 years ago. She is a development economist who for a decade was the lead author of the UNDP Human Development Report, amongst other accolades, and she's currently professor at the New School in New York City. Next, I want to introduce Usman Mushtaq over here, who has kindly agreed at the shortest notice ever to replace Uni Gopinathan, who unfortunately has fallen ill. But like Uni, he is a medical doctor and participated in the Youth Commission, so is also very well placed to comment on this. It was established alongside the Lancet-University of Oslo Commission. And in the decades since that, he's had a very impressive career that includes experiences such as advising the Pakistani Ministry of Health and the WHO, and also serving as vice mayor of our city of Oslo. Thank you very much for joining us. He will have to step out a bit before we finish due to a prior engagement. Desmond McNeill here is my colleague at the University of Oslo Center for Development and the Environment, which he previously directed. And he was also a commissioner 10 years ago, and is a political economist whose research interests are within governance, sustainable development, and the relationship between research and policy, and he has a wide array of experience drawn and commenting here. Next, Kelley Lee is a member of the Collective for Political Determinants of Health and is professor of global health governance at Simon Fraser University in Canada, and has also got a very impressive research record focusing on many different collective action problems and issues to address transnational health risks, and has been formative also in advancing attention and analysis of power within health governance. And is often quoted as saying that global health is shot through with power relationships. Ron Labonté is part of the People's Health Movement, which contributed background papers to the Commission's report a decade ago, and he was also among its critics. He is Professor Emeritus in the School of Public Health and Epidemiology at the University of Ottawa, and his most recent work there focuses on global governance and health impacts of free trade and investment treaties and issues to do with the globalization of health risks. And he has worked and consulted widely with UN agencies and is editor-in-chief with me on globalization and health. So I'm now going to invite each of our panelists to offer some introductory remarks in response to questions I will pose them. And then we will move on to a more moderated, structured discussion around the post-pandemic governance challenges that might affect how we understand transnational power and the political dynamics that shape health. So let's start with you, Ole Petter, and I'd like to ask you to comment a bit on the impetus behind the Commission 10 years ago, or it's more than 12 years ago, right? And the impact that its recommendations have had. Do you think that the Commission succeeded in promoting a greater focus on health and improving governance processes in these key policymaking domains outside of the health sector?
Wow, what a question. Well, the Commission report was published, well, more or less exactly 10 years ago. It was in 2014. I think it was in April or March. So it's an anniversary that we are celebrating. And it's time to try to understand, well, exactly as you said, did this Commission report have any impact whatsoever? In fact, I was reminded of what Richard Horton said last week or 2 weeks ago when we had a discussion with the chief editor of the Lancet. And he said that maybe the Commission 10 years ago was a bit ahead of its time, meaning that perhaps it's even more relevant today to look into the political determinants of health and how to improve global governance. Well, what kind of impact did it have? I checked today. It has, as of 8 o'clock this morning, received 654 citations. Well, perhaps that's not that impressive. But I should say that I've had so many positive comments from my colleagues in other universities in the world where they have used our Commission report for educational purposes. So isn't that something? Because whenever a paper or a report enters the realm of education, well, it's preserved somehow for posterity. But we have to be self-critical, we have to be modest, and it's very, very clear, as you said, that the recommendations were perhaps not elaborate enough. Perhaps they didn't go sufficiently far in criticizing extant power structures at the time. There is a room for improvement. So that's why I'm so happy that there now is energy, enthusiasm about launching a new commission. We can call it Global Governance for Health 2.0 or whatever, where we are looking into, again, the global governance structures that we must admit don't really function that well. And the pandemic has certainly been an eye-opener in this regard, but I'm sure we can get back to that later.
Thank you. Just to follow up very briefly, because you cited the citations of the paper and education, both of which are very important. But what about, do you have a sense of its impact outside of the health sector in other domains of governance than those dealing directly with health?
Well, it's very difficult to say, and this is a weakness of all Lancet reports, because no attempt has really been made to measure their impact. So again, we have to be a bit humble. We don't really know. Perhaps, and this is sincere, my sincere opinion, the best recommendation we had in our report 10 years ago was to establish, I think we call it the Scientific Monitoring Panel for Health, and that was converted, I guess, into your collective that you're heading now. And perhaps the most important impact is what followed when it comes to research that perhaps was at least a bit inspired by the Commission report. But it's a very difficult question.
Maybe one for further research.
Yeah.
Kelley. Okay, thank you so much, Ole Petter. I'm going to move on to Sakiko. I mean, as Ole Petter said, one of the Commission's recommendations was for a scientific monitoring board and greater attention to power asymmetries in global governance processes in research. And the Commission, when it finished, did lead to the establishment of an independent panel on global governance for health, which has, after its mandates expired, been sort of transformed and expanded into the Collective for Political Determinants of Health. I'm wondering if you can comment a bit, Sakiko, on the Commission's impact on scholarship, and particularly its attention to power as a major driver of health inequities.
Well, I mean, I think as Ole Petter was saying, difficult to measure impact. And I think that goes for all publications, what exactly impact. But I want to talk about what we mean by having an impact, because in my mind, commissions like this, I think, are essentially throwing out ideas to draw attention to issues of global importance and research importance that deserve greater attention. And it's an agenda-setting exercise. I'm not sure that you can expect or that one would aim in a commission like this to change this particular international policy or this particular national policy in governments. I mean, like the Lancet Commission 2014 had, was commenting on violent conflict, on austerity, etc., right? And the politics and the analysis and so forth of austerity are such that austerity continues. I'm not sure that we can be so. I mean, I think it's a bit beyond the possibility of one little report to change the economic policy making of all countries of the world with respect to austerity policies as a deeply embedded kind of a policy practice. But I think what our ambition should be is to actually change agendas. And I say this because of my experience with leading the UNDP Human Development Reports, which essentially had the same role of changing agendas. In thinking within the development community of people as an important element of something that we call development. It's not a new idea, but it's really brought that to the fore. And I think that's the sort of the same idea here with the Lancet Commission. And the message of the Commission was political determinants of health, right? That health inequities can be explained by power structures, but the important twist in all of that was not just about power structures within health sector, but outside of the health sector. And this is where I come back to what I was saying about Susan Sell's work. She was talking about change in the power structure in the global economic system, why it is that finance capitalism is very different from 20th century globalization kind of capitalism of investment and trade, right? And so why Wall Street is important, why these financial instruments are important. And I think that's the message, that's the agenda setting. And in that sense, I do think that there has been some impact. And I remember, the round table that we had at the ISA in Toronto. Antoine was there, Kelley was there. She very nicely at the last minute stepped in to chair our session. And it was incredibly well attended. There was a very robust discussion within the ISA community, not necessarily all health people. And I think, that's our role, and I think that's where we've been working, and I think there has been some greater momentum in recognizing politics in these debates.
Thank you. So really both an impact in terms of recognizing politics within health research, but also an impact of recognizing health inequities within broader political science and social science research.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sakiko. I'm going to move on to you, Usman, because 10 years ago you participated in the Youth Commission, which brought together, I think it was 16 young academic and professionals to work on an independent entity alongside the more senior Lancet-University of Oslo Commission. And back then, the Youth Commission argued that open-mindedness and innovative thinking that young people display can help to accentuate the work of the Commission and also provide valuable perspectives. And they're, also noted that young people have long shown enthusiasm and progressive action in the field. Now that a decade has passed and you have had a lot of real world experience of policy making at multiple levels and in different settings, can you reflect on the salience of the Youth Commission's recommendations 10 years on?
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's great to be here. I mean, I had to polish up my knowledge of the commission. But I was going to say to Ole Petter that I think the second most important thing you guys did you had the foresight to establish a youth commission, and it is incredible to think about how young we were. I mean, I was in my early 20s while we were doing this work, and already at that time, we were at a moment of time which was right before the Paris Climate Agreement came, the Sustainable Development Goals came, a lot of enthusiasm for a big trade bargain. And I remember a lot of the experience that many of the youth commissioners had been in the realm of positivity. So the world is moving into the right direction. And it is surprising to read some of our initial conversations, and I scrolled back on our email conversations and meeting notes, etc. And I think one thing that we did, which was fairly correct, and I recommend you guys to have a look at the executive summary of our Youth Commission report, and it was to take the conversation from very specific things that we should do right now to a step back. And reviewing of the major concepts of what's driving good health or bad health, and particularly in global governance for health. And there were three key things. And I think that if we had written the report today, these three key things will still stand, but maybe worded in a different way. First and foremost, I think we emphasize the importance of shifting power from the now to the future, at least giving the future a little bit more prominence. We discussed the concept of intergenerational solidarity. I think you see these concepts, and that was to a large degree also influenced by the climate change conversations that were going on at that time. And I think that obviously still stands today. I mean, I know for a fact that our decision-making abilities as a politician or policymakers, regardless of wherever you are in the world, is driven by very short-term interests. However, this intergenerational solidarity dilemma, I think, stands still at the core. And you see some glimmers of hope. You still see that, for instance, the major powers are able to collaborate on some issues, on climate issues. You see some collaboration still going on between China and the US amid this strategic rivalry that they have. So there is some glimmers of hope, and that I think still stands today. I still believe that we need to think more about the future, especially when you think about the power structures. Secondly, we discussed the idea of transferring power, or at least giving more power to civil society. And I think, so we suggested that we created a UN civil society observatory. I think, if we had worded it today, it would have not been that, but the concept of transparency, I think it is going to be core in the post-pandemic setup. I mean, what we experienced in the pandemic was, and I saw this and I lived this, was the fact that the nation states, they took control, proper control, and the transparency around decisions were not significantly high because you estimated the cost for waiting and doing the stuff that needs to be done to get transparency as too high, and you need to make decisions fast. And I think shifting that power again towards where we can examine decisions in the public discourse is incredibly important, but it comes with a caveat. Look at the conversations around the new pandemic treaty. Even in a country like Norway, right? You're seeing conversations that are led by extremes, polarized extremes in the society, which not necessarily would lead to the best result. How do you do that? How do you kind of hvordan du snekker det sammen? I don't know. But still, transparency I think is core. And by the way, not having a transparent global governance for health also, during the pandemic, we realized led to a lot of conspiracy theories. So this is, fueling itself. And then finally, we discussed the concept of moving away from just looking at health indicators while discussing global governance for health and looking at other indicators for well-being. So we championed the capabilities approach. This is very meta, but the idea was that if you have limited amount of resources and you've got to prioritize those resources, we're not advocating for all global resources to go to health objectives. You have many different other objectives that can also serve health purposes, and doing that in a capabilities approach, like with the real freedoms, was important. I think that still stands today, and that concept was actually at that time. There was a book that was published by one of the commission members, Sridhar. I don't know if he's online or listening, and that was a great source of inspiration. So I think that also still stands today. So if you had asked us, to write a similar report from the youth commissioners, many of them are global leaders now. Many of them are doing great things. I think you would get something similar, but maybe worded in a different way. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing attention also to these issues of transparency and power and decision-making, which I think will be a topic later on today. I was just wondering if you could also reflect a little bit about how the ideas in the Commission report and in the Youth Commission's supplement to that, how these ideas play out in your real-life practice, if at all. Like, what purchase do they have on decision-making processes of thinking about interventions in response to health crises, for example?
I think the issue around transparency is incredibly important. I have to say, I was in Pakistan when the pandemic started, and that has been my focus, my life for the past 3-4 years. And we made significant decisions that hit millions, hundreds of millions of people. It was insane. Suddenly we were very happy that we managed to convince the Prime Minister to lock down a country, and then 3 months later we find out we sent 8 million families to poverty, extreme poverty. Was that the right decision? I don't think so. Would we have landed on that decision if we had more transparency while we were making those decisions? I don't think so. And I think in a Norwegian or a high-income country perspective, decisions around the way that we introduced health interventions like vaccines, I think if we had built a better trust with the public by being much more transparent, then maybe the conversations that we're having now about conspiracy theories would not have been that high. And trust me, that hurt really, really, really bad. And it's hurting us now when we're having conversations about building a pandemic framework. So I think the issues around transparency is really important. And then obviously the perspective on future generations. My fear is that yes, there is a lot of emphasis of building public health systems, a lot of emphasis of building robust communities that can tackle crises like the pandemic at this moment, but that will fade away. And we're already seeing that, the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion, what's happening in Gaza right now. All of the other stuff that is happening that are man-made, all of that is chipping away focus. And that's why if there is a new commission that is going to focus on these issues, Ole Petter, then you have to make sure to bring back attention to the issue around future generations and how we shift power towards that. Because in my understanding, that leads to sound, fornuftig decision making.
Yes, Ole Petter would like to respond.
response to that, because if there was one thing we did right, I think, last time around, was to have this parallel youth commission. And it warms my heart to see how the members of that commission have now entered very, very important positions worldwide, including you. And you really embody the multi-level governance part of this challenge, because I remember we were in the UN together, and now you are in the City Council or advising the City Council. You embodied the multi-level governance for health that is so important. This time around, just very briefly, we will integrate the youth in our sort of what you call senior commission. And we will have one meeting specifically dedicated to the young generation and to what you call intergenerational solidarity. So we have learned a lot through your commission, through the Youth Commission, and we will follow up this time around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Desmond now, I think. You know, when the commission was published, it generated quite a wide response from different scholars and practitioners, and one of the responses was that the commission didn't really go far enough in its recommendations. It was criticized for promoting doable, politically feasible interventions of, quote, a talking shop and a monitoring mechanism, which really fell short of calling for the transformative change that the analysis in the report suggested would be necessary to address the health inequities it identified. So as someone who was involved as a commissioner and who has also done a lot of political economy analysis, why weren't the recommendations more radical? And what do you see as the prospects for radical critique and action within this area of global governance?
Right, yeah. I mean, let me step back a little. I think the advantage we had compared to some other commissions was that the mandate was explicitly political. I mean, we were invited to address global governance issues that are, quote, complex and politically sensitive and require a candid assessment of power structures. So it was already a political mandate. I believe we did it. But, and I think, as we've said, the report was very well received by many, but as we've also said, not all. And David McCoy and Ron Labonté, amongst others, I think it's fair to say that the summary there was strong on analysis, weak on recommendations. And there was a good debate on the MEDAC blog. And in response to David McCoy's comments, I said that I don't believe that we were censoring ourselves, either consciously or unconsciously. But I do also feel some weaker in terms of the recommendations. And I asked myself, you know, could we have done better in terms of recommendations? I mean, maybe we could have made some more, I think, rather general comments about power, recommendations about power, asymmetries, and what might be done there. But to address specific issues, I think we needed more time and more resources. We did, I mean, that was part of the reason we established the independent panel. The idea was, okay, well, now look into some of these specific issues. And we started with trade and investment, which is crucial, right? And we set up a smaller group where we brought in some people who are absolute real experts on the subject and know their stuff. And we did produce a paper which was published in a well-respected academic journal, and it had very specific recommendations. But this turned out, I mean, it's a fairly ineffective way. I mean, so of limited resources to produce one paper, which is why we turned to the idea of the what we now have, the collective, because also the independent panel arranged these two workshops, which you mentioned. And what was interesting in those workshops, and what's very important to us, was the feeling that we got back from people who attended, that of a common sense of common purpose. People who, in many cases, said, "Well, you know, we don't feel quite at home in our own academic situation. That we tend to, you know, we have this very political understanding of the problem, and that this is not broadly shared. And here we have a group of people who share our concerns, which is why I think the collective has become so dynamic." And I think the work we're doing is, and the collective is doing, is very good. It's the sense of common purpose But I still, even we in the collective share some of these concerns. How do we make a difference? I think, obviously, being a much larger number, and not just the members, direct members, but people out there who are following our activities. So I think the chances are better there to achieve something. And so I tend myself to produce academic papers, but some of the members of the collective are much more active in terms of blogs and being members of different commissions and policy-making bodies and so on. But I think, but still, the question arises how useful, how radical, how effective can we be in trying to bring about change? And I thought I would quote Ron, if I may, because I think he puts it quite well. He says, quote, "One of the problems with those of us who engage in global health debates from a pro-public health vantage is that we think that reasonable and evidence-informed conversation with a powerful elite should lead to nice, reasonable, diplomatic and generous compromise." End quotes. And of course, that is the danger. And I think there are activities that we can and should be involved in beyond academia, by drawing attention to these power asymmetries we've been talking about, and not simply lead to, quote, nice, reasonable, diplomatic and generous compromise, because that road, I think, leads nowhere.
Thank you, Desmond. I know, Sakiko, you want to respond specifically to that before I invite Kelley to.
Yeah. I think a lot had to do with the scope and the methodology of the report itself. I mean, we had a huge scope. And then in order to sort of bring it to life, we had 5 or 6 specific cases. But what kind, I think for anybody who thinks that there was some political self-censoring going on, I don't think that was the case at all. I think it's more that we kind of lacked imagination or just got exhausted. I'm not sure that it's even resources. I think it has a lot to do with the scope. And, I was a member of another, well, it's not a commission, it was a high-level panel on access to medicines and innovation. And that's a very specific, well-defined question. And it was about the incoherence between international law in human rights and international law on intellectual property. And we made a whole set of really important, significant, doable and undoable recommendations, many of which refused to be even mentioned or discussed in the World Health Assembly or the UN General Assembly because the powers, the vested interests blocked them from being discussed. That's how important they were, that they were blocked from being discussed. In any case, but what I'm pointing out is that you can make consequential recommendations, some of which, like even in my other case, some of the lower hanging fruit kind of recommendations have been pushed forward and others have not. But I think this is the nature of the beast, in a sense, that you have to define the scope of your exercise in a way that will lead to, doable policy recommendations. Our commission in 2014 was not. It was just too broad. And the message, it was really just a message, and somehow we didn't structure the analysis and the content in such a way that it would lead to doable recommendations. I sort of see it like that. But my mentor, Mahbub al-Haq, always used to say, each report has to have one of 3 things: a policy innovation, a measurement innovation, or a conceptual innovation. You can't always have all 3 in a single report. You can have maybe 1 or 2.
Okay, well, let's, moving on, focus on the conceptual innovation, which arguably was drawing attention to governance for health and the political determinants of health. And I want to move to Kelley, who has done so much work within health policy analysis and political science related to health and thinking conceptually about power and other issues. How useful is this concept of political determinants of health to think with, and how does it relate to other ways of conceptualizing the causes and mechanisms of health? For example, you've done work on measuring the commercial determinants of health, and we also know that there has been a whole array of work focused on the social determinants of health. Scholars are also talking about the technological determinants of health, etc. How do we make sense of this whole conceptual apparatus when we think and analyze these issues?
Well, thank you for that. It's a great question, and we were talking about the impact of the Commission, and conceptual innovation, I think, is something that you really should be given credit for, because, of course, the political determinants have been around a long time, but to put it in a Commission as the vehicle by which you look at all of these issues and to give it prominence, I think is, a great achievement. So is it the right vehicle going forward in the next, 10 years and beyond? The analytical value of this concept in particular, and its particular, I suppose, unique contribution. So if we consider that question, we need to go back a few decades and think about the original concept of social determinants of health, which we're all familiar with if you study medicine and public health. And it was really a way to broaden and even challenge that dominant focus on the biomedical, the focus on clinical care and biology, and really think about, how the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, and the fundamental drivers of these conditions. These are the words of the seminal WHO Commission. These factors are equally, if not more important. And so that was obviously a conceptual innovation in its time. That medical care and biology are obviously very important for health and well-being, but have limited ability to really explain who becomes sick or injured or dies in the first place. And so the social determinants of health was a very valuable advance, but it's also both broad and also left out a lot of things the way it was conceptualized. So efforts have been made since to zoom in on these key social determinants or other determinants that are non-biomedical, and to reflect on how our societies have evolved since that term was coined, particularly around economic globalization. So I like the title of Paula Braidman and Laura Gottlieb's paper from 2014, and they title their paper, "The Social Determinants of Health, It's Time to Consider the Causes of the Causes." So we're stepping back again. And so a number of related concepts, as you mentioned, Katerini, have since emerged which riff off the social determinants of health. Commercial determinants of health, or sometimes people call it the economic determinants of health, is one. Digital determinants, gender determinants, and so on. Ecological determinants is a term I've seen recently. And many of these terms, Ilona Kickbush has written on, of course, and she describes them as 21st century determinants of health. So we're still figuring this out. And we may see new concepts as our societies continue to evolve over this century. We could have robotic determinants of health. I was just trying to think, blockchain. We're moving into quantum, determinants of health. Who knows? We'll see more of these coming down the pipeline. And I'm sure there's a good paper that could be written conceptually trying to map these all out and how they relate together. I won't write that paper, but I challenge somebody out there to do that. But at the start, for me, if we dig down into the heart of all of these different concepts, and they are very varied, what they are really about are different forms of power and how this power is distributed in different ways and how this power is exercised in ways that impact health outcomes. So systems of profit generation and distribution, the commercial determinants of health, digital technologies, gender identities, ecosystems, they all shape health by embodying the distribution and exercise of power and unequal power in our societies. So I think in this sense, they are actually all about the political determinants of health as well. And I think the concept of political determinants is analytically valuable because it provides that unifying lens that connects all of those different terms we're seeing. It's the umbrella term for understanding those different forms, distribution, and exercise of power across all human societies that influence health outcomes. So I see that political determinants are the big umbrella, the others are the spokes. And if we see it that way, I think that would be a way of hopefully amplifying. Because since what's happened, since the commission was published, we've seen the political determinants have become, if not, equally important, more important. We've seen how it can both hinder health, but also amplify our health efforts. So I think that is the way forward, I think, for the next commission and the collective's work beyond today.
Thank you so much, Kelley, for helping us understand how these terms relate to each other and identifying the analytic value of looking at political determinants, both transnationally and nationally, I guess. I want to move on now to Ron and go, I guess, even broader to look at global political economy, because one of the strongest critiques of the Commission report was that it didn't actually break out of the dominant market-oriented model of global capitalism, which has contributed to the global health inequities and inequalities that it was set to analyze. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit on that and the Commission's legacy, considering both the pandemic and the crisis of globalization and challenges to multilateralism that it has brought to the fore. And also consider how this relates to the calls for shifting power and decolonization.
Well, I can try.
Okay, thank you.
And I do recall when I was working chairing the Globalization Knowledge Network for the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, how we also referred about our work as the causes of the causes, but then you could say the causes of the causes of the causes.
Yeah.
What's nice about political determinants of health is that we think about political basically means policy. So it's basically really driving us in terms of figuring out what are the choices that we need to make. And I think that the Commission actually, in moving a little bit away from social determinants of health, it actually helped to underscore how these determinants, or what in Latin America is referred to as the social determination of health, so it's a process, that these were not simply exogenous factors that had some kind of siloed reform, but they were endogenous outcomes of these political choices in economics that drive them. And I think in some ways, the Commission and the subsequent work of the collective really helped to systematize civil society activist and academic critiques of the public and private institutions that directly or indirectly affect and drive health outcomes, and that's through trade or investment, aid, debt, financing, banking, taxation, numbers, etc. Now, the report really was warmly received by public health activists, but of course, I being amongst them, not without kind of pointing out some of the shortcomings. Now, some of those shortcomings, and I'm going to run through a bit of a list in just a second, but I think part of it is that many of those shortcomings are more evident now than they were even 10 years ago. So we can cut a bit of generosity in that direction. So, nothing on the environmental crisis that we're now living with, and that perhaps that was a strategic decision. It was a bit like what happened with the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, a strategic decision. But given how ecosystems and political economies are absolutely intimately intertwined, we can sort of say, well, that's a bit of a regrettable one, and one that we should not repeat. An almost complete silence, I was a bit surprised by this, on neoliberalism and the policy tropes that really engendered the 2008 global financial crisis, which was part of the spark for the Oslo Lancet Commission in the first place. There was an overly optimistic assumption of institutional reform, but without addressing who or what it is that controls those institutions. Now, the critique of power inequalities that was really central to the report was really very, very much welcome, was lovely to sort of see. But there was no identification of who exactly are the powerful. How did they come to accrue that power, or to maintain it, and how that power could be constrained. So I think going forward, we need to identify who those actors actually are, call them out. There was little on the importance of taxation, regulation, legislation, etc., to alter this equalizing financialization that Sakiko talked about in terms of like 21st century version of capitalism. And nothing on the consumptogenic nature. That's a term that a colleague of mine, Sharon Friel, at Australian University likes to use, talks about consumptogenic kind of nature of the OECD Club of Rich Nations. There was a tacit, I think, an uncritical acceptance of the economic growth imperative, And also, the total absence of the C word. Okay, so no reference by name to capitalism or to any of the historical analyses of the structural tendencies of capitalism towards inequality and market failure, or even to the growing health literature that locates much of the worsening climate and environmental crises that they exist due to the capitalism's underlying logic of accumulation. So I think looking forward, there's very little disagreement that the conditions for health are worsening. So deepening inequalities, power inequities that this creates, climate change, sixth grade extinction, and especially now the population's on the move via migration, displacement, conflict, immiseration, and famine. And I think alongside this, in terms of global governance, we see an erosion of multilateralism, an erosion in global governance and trust in those institutions and the rule of law. So we have here the metrics: rising authoritarianism, an increasing theocratic rule or its invocation, a deepening polarization that's helping to fuel proxy military conflicts, this pandemic of misinformation, and a point that others have made, a near collapse of public trust in public institutions in many countries and regions of the world. And we could also perhaps even add to this what Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, what others might describe as rentier capitalism on steroids. So if we consider going forward in the next 10 years, I think my comments on the original Commission's gaps suggest some of the issues that could define the agenda over the next 10-year period. And we have the overarching question, and that is, what are the political processes by which the disequalizing features of our still dominant, if somewhat kind of ramped up 21st century capitalist economy, how might these be transformed into what the WHO's Council on the Economics of Health for All, amongst other similar bodies, describe as a well-being economy, an economy that is more democratic, more equitable, and focused, producing what is sufficient for human needs rather than on growth and capital accumulation. It's a big question, and I think that if nothing more, you have at least 10 years to sort of try to come up with some more answers. So that's
Thank you, Ron, for bringing that causes of the causes perspective to what we're talking about. Okay, so I think one of the questions I wanted to ask of the panel is that one of the major criticisms of the Commission was that it called for the establishment of a multi-stakeholder platform that would bring different governance actors from different sectors outside of health together to reflect on how health is affected by their various governance processes, and that this would be within the UN. But critics maintain that this would really further fragment global governance, and instead some, I think including you, Ron, called for the World Health Organization to be strengthened, and that for its presence in governance structures of other multilateral organizations whose decisions influence health, like the World Trade Organization and the World Bank, to be strengthened. But I think during the COVID pandemic, we've seen the WHO often marginalized in these fora, and also marginalized relative to more informal partnerships and governance platforms within the global policy arena. And I was wondering if the panel has comments on or agree with this observation. I mean, maybe thinking especially of you, Kelley, because you've written a book and more about and studied a lot the World Health Organization's role in global governance. What do you think of this issue of multilateralism and the WHO's position within it, and the relevance of health to other governance for outside of health?
Yes, it's a fundamental tension. If I could start, it's a fundamental tension between those who see, strengthening WHO as the key, because it is really what we have, and if we get rid of it, we just build something that looks very similar, or something that would end up operating quite similarly, or do we do blow it up and we create a really multilateral, almost network of institutions that work together. I think that the task of global health governance has become much more complex over time as societies become more interconnected, as we've made those lines between different policy areas more connected, and so we see that health is impacted by so many different sectors. So even sorting out our own house is challenging enough, but then extending it. But for me, I think the old forms of multilateralism are not the way to go, because there's so much now I guess, atrophy or lack of trust in those institutions. I think those, I've written before that we need institutional innovation. 1945 is when those foundations were built, and it was a different time. They were looking for a very different type of peace and security as it was structured upon. It was a very different world, and the institutions were designed for that vision. I think we do need like a post-1945 conference that brings together not just health, but all these collective action challenges. Climate change is a huge one, but there are many others where we get past these gridlocks because we're actually, these issues are more connected than we realize, more common. So I'm actually, I guess, advocating for an even more ambitious process, which I know is very challenging to think about. But if we keep focusing on health and the multilateral, fixing the multilateral and state-centric organizations that we have, I think we're only going to get so far. I think it's time for some true innovation in institution building.
Thank you, Kelley. And Usman wanted to comment from your experience as well, and then Ole Petter.
Yeah, I mean, WHO versus other institutions is a very interesting conversation. I spent a couple of years in one of these informal alliances that were made during the pandemic called the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, which was hosted by WHO. A lot of criticism on how that was functioning, a lot of criticism in terms of who was funding it and how much money was coming in and how that was distributed. But I have to say, WHO with the right leadership is an incredibly powerful organization, and we saw that during the pandemic. I disagree with the fact that WHO was marginalized. I don't think WHO was marginalized during the pandemic. I think, I'm biased, obviously. I was working with Tedros for a couple of years, but the way that WHO navigated the pandemic as an institution with what it had coming into the pandemic, I think was absolutely remarkable. Within the ACT Accelerator as well, the way that it was politically maneuvered to make sure that WHO had the room to maneuver how the money was spent, I think was incredibly important, because we were talking about 20, 30 billion dollars. It was a tremendous amount of money. But from a low and middle income country perspective, it was interesting to see when, sorry for my French here, shit hits the fan, then the discussion around what are the trade laws, the way that international governance should function, all of that takes back seat. I mean, there is no country out there, especially low and middle income country, that for a second would think that India, US, or Germany or the UK or France would act any different if another crisis hit with the way that they treated with the vaccines and other diagnostic material or medicines that were in short supply. I don't think anybody believes that, hence why countries now, very rightly so, are focusing on building their primary healthcare systems and building their capabilities. And that is probably not the best way of spending resources. I mean, why would every country have vaccine production? I mean, you don't necessarily need that. That's not the most cost-effective way to do this. But this is the inefficiencies at the global governance level and the way that politics work that is implementing in the way that resources are being used. So my point with saying that is one antidote is having stronger regional focus. I think that absolutely helps. Africa is a great example. The way that they came together was not perfect. How the African Union handled things, but it was still a way of handling things in a world where they don't control all the resources and they definitely don't have all the power. And WHO's role becomes incredibly more important because WHO is that organization that advocates for low and middle income countries, even though it is funded by high income countries, right? So high income country funding doesn't necessarily mean that that institution is tainted or the interests are tainted in all its ways. It's very important to have that in mind. And then finally, I just want to, this is a question that I have actually, and it would be great to hear some reflections. Is health really a unifying concept for all sectors when they're making decisions? Personal experience is it's not. I know my health minister in Pakistan sat at the end of the table before the pandemic, and even during the pandemic, I mean, you know, he was sitting at the end of the table, and it was the development minister that led the work. And in Oslo, I mean, you know, as a vice mayor, I was working with employment. I had my responsibility was employment and social services. I created a very multifaceted strategy for tackling social inequality. Health was mentioned. Purposefully, I did not mention health in the fields of getting people employment and linking that to a health goal, because within those sectors, that was not seen as a priority. So I think we need to also be kind of clear-eyed in terms of how much influence we have over other sectors, and also what we need to do within our own sector. Sorry, that was a little bit of a rant.
No, it's great. And it got to the question that I asked you originally, so it's wonderful. Thank you so much. Ole Petter, you also want to comment on this question?
3 points. And the first thing is that, of course, I completely agree with Kelley that we need to do something about the structure that was established 1944-45, the Bretton Woods structure, because it's high time that this is revised to really take into consideration the current challenges that we are seeing. In fact, we published a paper in Nature Medicine during the pandemic where we asked specifically for a new Bretton Woods meeting with quite a lot of interesting comments. I won't go into detail about that. But the second thing has to do with WHO, and Kelley, Usman, you raised the issue about WHO, and I think we had a brief conversation prior to this session where I think we agree, yes, there is absolutely hope that WHO can continue to be a strong force. To give up WHO is, in my mind, no option at all. And in fact, the interesting thing during my stint as president of Karolinska Institutet, we established an agreement, an MOU with the science division of WHO. I think the establishment of a science division is a fantastic opportunity to get the WHO not only to be governance of health, but governance for health. Remember, we were playing with these prepositions during the Lancet Commission that what we need is governance for health. That is the cross-sectoral dimension. And there was a huge willingness in the science division to really build some sort of multi-stakeholder platform, global governance for health platform, under Soumya Swaminathan. Now there's a new leadership, as you know, and we wonder what will happen now. But I think that what has happened is that the concept of a multi-stakeholder platform perhaps should be moved from the UN as at large more to more specific organizations, including the WHO. The third point is exactly what you are referring to, Usman, because in the last discussion we had also with Richard Horton, I mean, we have to be realistic. We are living in a very dangerous and turbulent world, and our global governance structures are perhaps not really seeing health as the supreme goal. I mean, health supremacy is not very evident in the global governance system today with the wars and the crisis. So there is an opportunity now and a need, I think, to look at regions. And this will be a task for the new Commission, to see to what extent we can empower regions that already have this growth of institutions that perhaps can take over some of the governance responsibilities that previously resided at the global level. And in Africa, of course, with the growth of the Africa CDC, there is a tremendous opportunity to really empower the regions. And as we speak, I'm very much directly involved in projects in Africa, where Africa CDC is an important player. Perhaps it's time to shift a bit multi-level governance again from just the global governance level to empowering the regional level. Thank you.
Sakiko, you want to comment too?
I just want to mention one thing that has not been said here until now in thinking about these governance structures, which is simply a matter of power relationships amongst states and countries. And you say, let's go regional. You know, a cynical way that I can look at this is to say, okay, the rich countries don't want to share their power, so they're just saying, okay, you take care of yourself, Africa. You take care of yourself, Asia. And we in Europe and North America and the OECD will take care of ourselves. Well, that's not going to work because the resources are so concentrated in the OECD countries. You know, that there's a limit that these regions can do on their own. That's the whole point, actually, of global inequalities. I mean, when 90% or so of the medical patents are held by like 3 countries, you know, it's now, so all of these Bretton Woods institutions, the post-Second World War institutions that were created with dominant power in the hands of the certain countries. Now, of course, this is different, you know, depending on the institution itself. But, I mean, I think we need to recognize that low and middle income countries are politically frustrated. You know, I mean, I think that the history of the last 3 or 4 years has been that, oh, you know, the rich countries have abandoned, even in a kind of an existential crisis of a pandemic, you know, abandoned, so to speak. The head of the Gates Foundation, Mark Usman, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs saying one more reason why you know, low and middle income countries should be frustrated with the North or something like that. But I have had many conversations with my friends in Africa who say, well, you know, what do you expect? You think that we're going to just support the American position on Ukraine? Just look what they did to us during the pandemic, right? And I think that sentiment is growing together with the geopolitical reconfiguration of economic power, the political realignments, and so forth. So I think that we need to recognize that in thinking about this notion of multilateralism and how that has changed.
Ron, you want to comment on this too?
One brief statement is just kind of to note that it's not that the rich countries control, or that they have the resources, is that if we think that what the resources, the material resources are for wealth creation, most of those are sitting in poor countries. It's just that it's the rich countries that control the extraction of those resources. So there's that power, which then brings me to the other point, is that if we keep focusing on the role of governments and states, we have to look at what is driving the interests of those states. Because right now, the amount of global wealth that is private, held in private hands, transnational corporate hedge fund, private equity, and so forth, so outstrips what's held in public governance hands. I mean, that's got to be the critical power question that any ongoing kind of work around political determinants of health has to confront.
Thank you. I'm going to be opening up to questions from the audience, but I also wanted to ask, you know, the Commission, Ole Petter now made comment about acronyms, not acronyms, prepositions, whether we were focusing on governance of health or governance for health. And the Commission explicitly focused on governance outside of the health sector. And so it said this is different from global health governance, which many of us do identify as our area of study. But in doing so, it excluded the role of private philanthropy, of official aid for health, and of public-private partnerships, which has arguably become the governance paradigm that has become most dominant in the past 20 years, and which not only has changed the role of the WHO and other UN agencies, but it's also brought actors from the global financial sector, the global technology sector, and the pharmaceutical industry into the heart of global health governance. So does it make sense to exclude, to draw this distinction, or isn't it a false dichotomy between governance of health or governance for health? Aren't these things now so interrelated that we also need to interrogate the power asymmetries and governance dysfunctions inside of the health sector, which is now permeated by all these other health sectors? Yes, Ron?
Well, I think, yeah, we could be a philosophical question about of or for and other kinds of nice little linguistic asides. But I think that just as social determinants of health was really an attempt to break out of a biomedical preoccupation with health and its determinants and its outcomes, the governance for health was an attempt to break out of a focus only on health systems. So in that sense, it was just a way of sort of saying we have to consider all of these others. I think probably at this point in time, we could get rid of those prepositions and just talk about global governance and health.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, to some extent, yeah, when we said we don't want to look at the global governance of health, we're talking about a sort of narrow, different discussion about the role of the WHO. And I think everyone would agree, in the Commission would have agreed that all these issues about the role of the private sector and the financial sector and so on were very much in. They weren't excluded as a result of us shifting from of or for. And so I think, but the other point is that when you use the word for, that gives a more sort of normative. And I would say, well, I think, so the power, for me, the importance of the analytical is as a basis for the normative is crucial. So I think that many of the things you've been saying about the role of the private sector and so on, I mean, our role is just to demonstrate and empirically the realities of power in the private sector, private-public partnerships and so on. So I don't think that's excluded by using the term of, and it certainly wasn't excluded from our mandate.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to comment on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a kind of I don't think we need to really discuss this terribly much. I don't really see a problem when I think about the work of people like Susan Sell. That is not traditionally in the domain of the work on governance of the health sector. But you need to have that kind of an analysis to complete, you know, and you need to have people like her who are political scientists, economists, who specialize in global economic governance and financial architecture and so forth, to understand the need for governance of health, if you know what I mean. So, I mean, in terms of the scope of research, the scope of analysis, governance of health needs to be expanded to analysis of non-health sectors. And I think, in a sense, the term governance for health puts attention to that need for enlargement.
No,
you can
my
see it
point
in
was
both ways.
My point was more that all of these sectors also operate within the global health
exactly.
governance, within the institutions that were
Yes.
excluded from the Commission's report,
Exactly.
like
Absolutely.
the WHO.
Yeah.
Yes, Usman, please.
I mean, this is an interesting conversation. I think, you know, if we're talking about the name of the new commission, you'll have to determine, first and foremost, is that going to be an academic exercise, or is it going to be linked with something? And I think if you go into issues around how capital is distributed, very many people that work on these issues will automatically, not see health as a, as the first thing that come to their mind, because we're talking about social inequality in broader terms. So I think defining the name of the new work that you're going to do have to be pinpointed towards what is it that is wanting to be achieved. Is it, and I think for academic purposes, it makes a lot of sense to go in with a health lens and look at every other sector. I'm just slightly unsure how tangible of an effect it will have directly on the real world discussions that are happening right now.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in a question from the audience. Unfortunately, the person has not identified themselves, and I can't do that here. But the question is that, the person says that Professor Labonté made a strong call to focus on neoliberalism and the global capitalist system, and Professor Fukuda-Parr also emphasized the challenge to more equitable global governance, this is a fair point. However, if we look at some of the most recent crises, like the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Palestine war, the failure of governments to address COVID-19 pandemic effectively and equitably within their own borders, Is a lens that's focused so narrowly on capitalism enough to understand the range of the most influential political determinants? Or does it risk leaving out other political determinants that are not primarily rooted in neoliberal ideology, like nationalism, tribalism, hatred, and disinformation? Interesting question.
Great question.
And I also invite people in the room to prepare questions if you have any for after this very interesting question.
Are we supposed to answer that question?
Yes.
Good luck.
I emphasize the kind of the underpinning logics of capitalism and what economics and politics and power have to play on that. But I think it doesn't mean that one reduces all explanations or all concerns about what is happening to a simple grand narrative. Here's the one kind of cause. But at the same time, I would argue that the nature of the economic system, which we call capitalism, whether we take it 21st century or consider it all the way going back to the 1600s, that the underlying structuring kind of qualities or logic of that system, that under conditions of uncertainty and inequality, it is creating these proxy conflicts. It is creating an increase in this kind of retreat into a tribalism. It is increasing kind of a shift into this autocratic extreme right. Because we failed in the past, in the recent past, to actually have liberal democratic processes that have managed to sort of kind of deal with what are the crises now that everybody's experiencing in their lives. And so they're the only people who are coming up with the short answers are the ones who are sort of with a short ideology, the short narrative to try to make people feel better, happen to be autocrats. And it just also happens to be that autocrats tend to come from the right.
Right, anyone else?
Well, I would just jump in. I don't know if I'm going to answer the question directly because I didn't make the original points, but I do think that when we think about politics and governance, that we be self-reflexive. Like you were asking earlier, Katerini, about, you know, should we be thinking about governance within the health, within WHO and so on. I think we should look at all of these things because often when we think about good governance, we think, well, those other guys aren't doing it right, or, you know, we look elsewhere. But I think if we start at where we're standing, we're all part of this governance challenge, and are we part of the problem or part of the solution ourselves? So this sense of self-reflection, even on the Commission. The Commission is a political process, as well as studying the political determinants. The collective has a political role in some way. So if we accept that, and it's not a bad thing, I'm not saying you shouldn't. I think actually it's important that you play this role, but you need to do that in a form of being self-reflexive about that. And so all forms of, I see it as different levels of governance rather than different spheres, and they're very much connected, like a plate of spaghetti, increasingly. But that the starting point is really to be aware of your own positionality. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. Sakiko, did you want to comment? No. Okay. Yes, there's a question from the audience in the room here. Please, can you identify yourself for the audience, even though I know you very well?
Yes, hello. My name is Felix Stein, and I've been working as part of the PanPrep team for the University of Oslo for the past 3 years on global health governance. And I just wanted to remark that in the opening remarks, you asked 2 questions, namely, why didn't you have more impact, and why weren't you more critical? But I just wanted to mention that it is very hard to square these two in contemporary global health very often. Because as soon as you say something critical, such as corporate power has gone up to levels that we've never seen before, maybe we should speak more about taxation, maybe we should speak more about regulation, eyebrows are raised or insults come from the people who are in power at the moment in global health, and to dominate the discourse and to drown out voices from the global south to make these very points over and over again throughout the COVID-19 crisis. So I thought it was a difficult opening for our panel to respond to both of these critiques at the same time.
Yes, that was the intention too. Let's hear what Ole Petter has to say about squaring the circle.
We are now zooming in on one of the dilemmas that I guess every Commission is seeing. I mean, this is the fine balance. I mean, we want to make a difference. That's a point. That's the most important point of a Commission, to use the evidence available to us and a very stringent analysis to really come up with recommendations that eventually, hopefully, will make a change. So this is a fine dilemma, because, of course, if we call for a revolution of absolutely everything on the governance level, I don't think we will make very much headway. So there is a certain pragmatism to this that we really have to accept. And then, of course, we expose ourselves to criticism, because we are not radical enough. By the way, the criticism that you and David, not least, came up with is very important to us, because now we will use this criticism to improve our work in the new Commission. But still, the dilemma, which I really hope we could discuss in more detail, remains. We must be pragmatic because we want to instill change. At the same time, of course, we must not be taken as supportive of some of the very, very difficult power structures that exist today, including who is sitting on the money, as you said. So this is the most important thing. This dilemma will always be with us.
So, Desmond, you want to say, do you agree that we should always be pragmatic?
No. Well, I mean, I've been involved also in another, to some extent, similar exercise, the International Panel of Experts on Food Systems, producing reports very much with a political mandate. And I've argued in those reports that, in a sense, we've got to think about our audience. There's three different audiences. One is those people who already accept our critics. You've got another audience who will never listen whatever we say, right? It's the audience in the middle that we have to consider, the people who are open to ideas and open to criticism. And for them, what matters is the empirical credibility of our facts and argument, which is why the academic becomes not just a sort of a negative word, but a word saying something which stands on which people believe and trust, and so that I think ideally that's the situation. I know it's optimistic, but I think that ideally that's the way of not exactly squaring the circle, but responding to the challenge, is to say, okay, what we will present arguments and empirical data which are incontrovertible, and that at least it may not convince all those people in power, but it may convince enough people who have some possibility of influencing those in power to make a difference.
Sakiko and others have talked about the issues of trust between wealthy countries and poorer countries, and the shifts that have gone on geopolitically, the rises of violent conflict, etc. One of the major changes that has occurred in the field since the Commission published its report a decade ago is the growth of movement to decolonize global health, decolonize knowledge, and redistribute power that has been concentrated very heavily in northern countries and institutions, often led by white men. How do you see this development impacting the work of the political determinants of health and this discussion more broadly? Yes, Sakiko.
Well, I mean, I think this is I think I relate to the decolonization agenda as an analytical approach, where one looks at power structures and the way that power structures work by bringing in issues that have not been attended to very much, such as historical legacies, and that allow you to identify certain problems. For example, in my work on intellectual property, it's quite clear that the legal structures of African countries are traceable to that actually get in the way of using intellectual property more creatively and for public interest. Go back to historical legacies of French and British legal systems, and also the kind of knowledge that is imparted through regional intellectual property organizations and through the Western-centric thinking about intellectual property that imbues the normative practices of global institutions like WIPO, right? So, I mean, by thinking through this kind of analytical lens of decolonization, you begin to understand better. I mean, you're not necessarily finding a solution, but you have a different kind of an analytic, and you begin to understand why certain ideas that are appropriate to the countries that are very different from the countries in hand, in question, are being used. I mean, so I mean, this is the kind of, and then you see how this system is being maintained by the interest groups now, today. So you have the historical problem, and how this becomes, you know, this is a sticky institutions bit. This does not change because it is being deliberately maintained by actors who have an interest in that kind of a knowledge system. So I mean I think it's there are various concepts within the colonial thought that are very useful for understanding different kinds of power structures, and particularly epistemic power, and how that is exercised, and how that is pervasive. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakiko. Yes,
I have
you
to
need to
leave.
go.
Yeah.
I would like to invite you, if you have 1 minute, if you have any closing remarks, because we're actually going to move on to closing remarks now anyway, because we only have 5 minutes left. If you could just say, what is your main takeaway from this, and what do you think we should be focusing on as a research community going forward?
I think, you know, your comment was brilliant, because there is a one-to-one kind of linear causality between, you know, how radical you can go versus and how much impact you can have. And I think the key thing will be to identify where is it that we actually, I mean, thinking as a politician, where is it that we have the leverage? Like, you know, we can talk about everything, but where is it that we have the leverage, and how can we utilize it in best possible way? And setting together a group of people that can actually, you know, utilize the leverage in best possible way to create a little bit of change. And also, I think it's great that we're examining the point of time that we had this main commission, you know, 10 years ago. That gave a reflection of the world at that time. The world has changed quite a lot. The new commission will give a reflection at, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 years' time, and that will reflect the world at that time, and that will keep on changing. So I think not being too scared of being pragmatic, I think it's the right approach. And finally, just a practical advice. I had the pleasure of also conceptualizing another Lancet commission, which ended up becoming very successful, and that was the EAT Lancet Commission, which was the most successful Lancet commission, I think, ever, in terms of citations, in terms of impact, and policy impact. Look at that. And in terms of the communication around it, the way that it engaged with politicians and people in low and middle income countries, you know, definition of success, I think, has to be for the new commission that we're actually able to move the needle. Maybe not everywhere, but in few places, and that can actually be a little bit more tangible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, for the rest of you, we now have 3 minutes till closing, and you can do the maths. What are your thoughts coming out of this panel discussion? Where should we be heading further? Yeah.
When I think back about how to approach kind of critical political health research in other countries, or even back in my own country in Canada, how to engage with politicians about these research questions. One of the techniques that seem to have greatest impact or greatest probable outcome in terms of being able to engage is when you go to retired politicians, when you go to people who were there, but they're no longer sort of having to deal with the day-to-day nitty-gritty and compromises that happen around cabinet or parliamentary decisions. So if I think about that at a global scale, Let's look at the Alliance of the Elders. I mean, the Elders group has really made a lot of very powerful statements during the period of the pandemic and at other times. So finding some kind of an alliance with that organization of the former political leaders. The other, I want to go back to this notion of the low-hanging fruit and the high-hanging fruit, or whatever that Sakiko brought up, is I think, the tendency will go to the low-hanging fruit. So I think that what you do is you need to elevate the statements about the high-hanging fruit so bloody high that even the low-hanging fruit that's left over is still a whole lot higher than otherwise it might be. And you use the elders to help you in that process.
A higher level of ambition solved by the elders rather than the youth. Okay, thank you, Ron. Kelley.
Well, I think my takeaway would be that the political determinants of health are incredibly important, more important than ever before. What we've seen during the pandemic is a huge polarization of societies and across societies, and so this exercise would be incredibly important. And to move it forward, I come back to the, this advice that you often hear about in interpersonal relationships. Is it better to be right, or is it better to have meaningful, peaceful relationships that we can all live together? We don't all have to be right all the time, but I think if we can find a way of being right enough that we can have this collective coexistence, I think that's where we need to move.
Thank you.
I'd just say I'd sort of a vote of confidence in the collective and especially the next generation. I mean, some of us are getting too old for this, but we need the energy of people around the world. And I'm hoping that the interest that's been shown in this exercise here and will grow, and that the collective, not just the members themselves, but the whole broader group of people who are interested in our work will expand, and especially with younger people coming in to take over and make some change.
Hope so too. Thank you very much. Very briefly, Sakiko. And then
I find this conversation very invigorating, actually. I mean, reinforcing a sort of a renewing confidence in this idea of political determinants of health as a very central. Kelley called it a diagnostic tool or analytical lens, and I think that this obsession with the practical impact still bothers me, because I think that this is unrealistic. That what we need in terms of practical impact is a big concept and some sort of a big idea, and the operationalization of a big idea will take time to work out. But planting seeds of big ideas for reform, institutional reform, maybe that's what we can try to aim for.
So planting seeds and having some patience.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ole Petter, final word, very briefly.
Yes, and a seed is a good narrative. We need an even better narrative than we had the last time around. What has appeared from this very interesting discussion that we have had is, in my mind, a need to focus even more emphatically on power asymmetries, extending beyond, in fact, decolonization, because that's only one subfield of the power asymmetries that drive ill health. So this will be a very important part of the new commission. But the challenges are enormous. Let's face it, we are coming up with recommendations in a geopolitical situation that is more difficult than we have seen, at least in my generation. So the word pragmatism still has to be taken into account. Just this morning in The Economist, a title that gives us some additional challenges, of course, we all know, the fragility of the Western coalition. We have to start a new analysis with a sort of look into the crystal ball. How will the power structures at the geopolitical level develop in the time to come? But also we have to go in the other direction to look at perhaps some of the primordial power asymmetries that we are not aware of usually. For example, in a discussion we had in Africa just a few weeks ago, we saw that the research provided by African researchers often is not captured by Scopus or other, instruments that are supposed to capture the research on global health. This is a power asymmetry that we don't really think of. It's a primordial asymmetry that can drive other asymmetries. So we have to go the entire range of power asymmetries. That's it. But could I have one thing, last sentence? I'm grateful to SUM, to Collective, for doing this. And for me, it's fantastic to be back in the extended family with Desmond and Sakiko, with Sitzel, Inger, Anne-Louise has left, I guess, because this reminds me of the fantastic work we had 10 years ago. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of the panelists for launching these 2 days with a reflection on the Lancet Commission. We will now take a break for 30 minutes. We'll be back at 11:30 Central European Time, and for another session that will look at accountability and power in the global health system, looking a bit forward from the Commission. So thank you very much to the panelists for your contributions, and to the audience as well for your participation. Thank you.